Welcome to the podcast that takes apart Paul Krugman's New York Times column. Join us as Tom Woods and Bob Murphy teach economics by uncovering and dissecting the arrows of Krugman, Nobel Prize winner, newspaper columnist, and destroyer of nations. It's time for Contra Krugman.
Hey everybody, Tom Woods here with Bob Murphy with the honorary 226th episode of our old podcast, Contra Krugman. But in a more accurate sense, it's episode 2581 of the Tom Woods Show and episode something or other of the Bob Murphy Show. We'll both be releasing
it's a lower
it as
number.
A crossover
That's all we're certain of. It's lower than yours.
That's right. That's more. So we knew when we heard that Paul Krugman, whom we dedicated an entire podcast to for 5 years, was retiring as a New York Times columnist, it would be wrong. There would be some kind of an imbalance in the universe for there not to be some Tom and Bob episode just providing you all with some kind of closure. You know, I mean, I think we surprised people. We took them by surprise when in episode 225, we said, that's it, goodbye. We've already answered everything Krugman has to say. There's no point in going on. That left people a little cold. It was like the finale of Lost or something, Bob, you know?
Yeah, I agree with that. And yes, in it, I think Krugman probably would be expecting us to say something. It might actually hurt his feelings if we didn't.
He would be disappointed. As a matter of fact, he found out about this podcast because we figured eventually he had to. And because he found out about our cruise, the old Contra cruise, may it rest in peace. He found out about that and commented on that. That he thought it was in a weird way kind of flattering that people would devote all this attention to him. And I guess, Bob, if there were a whole cruise dedicated to bring people on board and part of the proceedings involved critiquing you or me, I mean, there would have to be some level on which you would say this, some coolness to that.
I would think so. Yeah. I mean, you and I have our share of haters, and there are people that I occasionally check in on just to keep me honest and to see. And I'm like, no, I still think I'm right.
Yeah. Well, speaking of being right, we're going to go through and review what we consider some of our favorite Krugman arguments and claims over the past however many years. Now, we started Contra Krugman because Bob here, who is, of course, the host of the Bob Murphy Show, but he's also, as he kept reminding me numerous times, a PhD in economics from New York University, and the author of many books, including a book called Contra Krugman. He had done so much on, I mean, not because Krugman himself is the most significant person in the world, but he has a tremendous reach. And because we felt like, and Bob felt like when he started writing his articles, you can learn a lot about economics if you read Krugman and correct it. And during this series, by the way, we were very happy to acknowledge those cases in which Krugman got something right. We were not unreasonable. But today we are unreasonable because all we're going to do is go through and find what we thought were the worst, the lowlights of the Paul Krugman body of work, at least in terms of his popular work as a New York Times columnist. So,
if you don't mind, Tom, before we dive into that, though, I just want to follow up with what you're saying, because this was a recurring thing that people would say a lot, like, oh yeah, Krugman's an idiot. What are you guys giving him a platform for? And you just to officially say again, no, he's not an idiot. If he were, then he wouldn't be dangerous. And there is a sense people might be surprised by me saying this, thinking I'm just getting soft in my older age. He was an economist to be grappled with, right? That he actually had a perspective. And that's partly why I think you'll agree, Tom, we eventually retired the show, because near the end there, it didn't feel like we were debating an economist anymore. He just was some columnist who had his preconceived, like he knew what the Democratic Party line was, and he would just throw something together to come up. Whereas the earlier Krugman, yes, he was really wrong, but he, stuck his chin out there and he was specifically wrong about specific things about how the economy works. And so then since we disagreed, it, as you say, showcased an opportunity for us to teach the public. Whereas later on, you couldn't teach anything because he was just so predictable and, one-dimensional.
And he became so boringly partisan, and he would write articles that were just politics instead of economics. So then it just became, well, then we'd have to search for a blog post he had written or a tweet he put out.
Right. I forgot about that. Yeah, we would actually have to, we'd move beyond the column that, yes.
Yeah, just to have some material to talk about. So anyway, you know where you will have things to talk about. Anyway, it doesn't matter. Let's talk about And notice that that's the obverse, maybe. Would that be the word we would use of where you won't? Because I actually am putting on a cruise, but I can't use where you won't, because that's our thing. So let's start in with let's have you talk about the inflation matter, because we all distinctly recall, not just Krugman but other people, telling us that price inflation of the sort that we have endured over the past, I don't know how long it's been now, was merely, quote, transitory. But Krugman, I don't know if above all, but let's say I associate the idea of transitory inflation very largely with Krugman.
Right. And so again, to set the stage, so there's, the Krugman ran many victory laps because guys like me, and I'm not just sulking, like he pointed me out by name, saying that these economists, after the, when QE went into effect and were warning about rapid price inflation, it didn't happen. And look, they haven't changed their views one iota, just proves how ideological they are. They're not scientists. Okay, so that happened. Then going into, the COVID lockdowns and such, and the Fed just dumped in even more boatloads of money, and CPI started rising rapidly. And guys like Krugman, so in his defense, someone like Larry Summers was coming out, who's no laissez-faire anarcho-capitalist by any stretch, and he was saying, guys, I think the Fed's running too hot here. We need to start hiking interest rates and, slowing the rate of money growth and so forth. And a bunch of his colleagues, also Keynesians, came forward and said, no, that's wrong. This inflation is just transitory. It's because of supply bottlenecks. The whole world economy, supply chains were locked down. What do you think is going to happen? We just as soon as we get the supply chains running, opened up again, everything will be fine. And again, that term they used was, this inflation is transitory. And so, we can link in the show notes page, folks, to give you the documentation. But throughout the 2021 and 2022, for much of it, Krugman kept saying, okay, that's it. We've seen the worst of it. It's behind us. And he was mocking like Fox News people along the way. Like, oh, they're trying to warn people this is going to be like, the late 70s, early 80s, when no, this is nothing like that. And then finally, I think it was in the November of 2022 time, he finally threw in the towel and said, I was wrong about inflation. All right. So he did say it at some point. That's how bad it got. It was just many points higher than when he initially had said that's it.
Well, Bob, when we retired from this show, I retired from following Krugman. I didn't realize that he acknowledged that.
No, he did. But again, it's Krugman. So, don't worry, that's not the end of the story. So he did do that. And he kind of had to. It's not, we should congratulate him. I mean, it was just, he had been so off. Like I said, when year over year inflation was around 5% and change, he was mocking people at Fox News for still worrying about inflation. Right. And then, of course, it went much higher than that. And we had for people who don't know, they don't remember, according to the government's own numbers, right? And I know people will say that they fudged it, but the official numbers showed that this was the worst CPI inflation in 40 years. Okay. So this wasn't some little blip. And so, he did say that time, but then after, he kind of walked it back and he said team transitory was right after all. And then specifically, so I summarized this. So in September of 2023, Krugman had a tweet thread on this stuff. And he said, we could still have a recession, but it will be a policy error, not something we needed to control inflation that turns out to have been transitory after all. Okay. And so then I spelled out the step-by-step here. And I know we got to move on to the next one, but just to get, so at the time I responded to that and said to people, I just want to make sure you folks understand how amazing his move is. To review, 1, Summers said, meaning Larry Summers, we need to hike rates to rein in inflation. Too bad this is going to cause a recession. 2, Krugman said, no, inflation's transitory. It will come down without rate hikes, which will only cause a needless recession. 3, the Fed ended up listening to Larry Summers and it jacked up the rates very aggressively. 4, inflation comes down. Krugman says, see, no recession, inflation was transitory, I was right. 5, Krugman admits there still could be a recession, but if it happens, it will be because of the rate hikes, which were unnecessary. And how do we know they were necessary? Because inflation came down with no recession. Okay, so I don't know if I'm conveying that, but it was the amazing back and forth throughout that people were warning if the Fed hikes rates, it's going to cause a recession. And then they did it. and inflation came down and there wasn't an immediate recession. And then they said, okay, see, it was transitory after all, but he still left open the door. There could be a recession, but if there is, it's just because they raised rates. It's not because we needed it. So I don't know if I'm conveying how he was having his cake and eating it too, but he was. But again, Tom, big picture, he admitted he was wrong and then later said, no, team transitory was right after all. So no, he ended up being right. So he gets to congratulate himself for admitting he was wrong, but actually he wasn't really wrong.
Well, as I was prepping for this, and I was looking back at your book, Contra Krugman, and then looking back at some of the episode titles.
Who was the narrator on that?
Boy, who would volunteer to narrate a book of that size?
Somebody must have lost a bet, I would think.
Yes, I mean, that was, I can't imagine somebody being as dopey enough. I'm the one who did it, everybody. I read that thing, and I thought, geez, why won't Murphy narrate his own audiobook? And I figured out the answer to that question about 5% into the project. So, all right. So one that I dug up was involved Herbert Hoover. So Herbert Hoover, in the standard telling of it that the average American believes, was a stupid idiot who sat there and let the Great Depression unfold when he could have used all kinds of government policy to try to push it off. And by the way, these government policies to hold off the Depression, by and large, this is an anachronism because Keynes hadn't written the general theory yet in 1929, or indeed even in 1932. But in any case, it is alleged that Hoover sat by and let the Depression wash over the country, and his feeble administration gave way to the righteous activism of Franklin Roosevelt. Well, in particular, Krugman has gone on a kind of a tear on this, where he has said what he's trying to do is not tell us the history of the 1920s and 30s. That's not interesting. What's interesting is the lessons we're supposed to draw from that period that we can apply to today. So that when he's talking about the aftermath of the crisis of 2008, he was saying that we're dealing in the states, unfortunately, with 50 Herbert Hoovers. So, in other words, 50 state governors who were supposedly too stingy to engage in the kind of spending that's necessary to push economic activity forward. That if they don't spend and the private sector isn't spending, then everything grinds to a halt. So we need them to be the opposite of Herbert Hoover. Because in the old days, we all know Herbert Hoover in 1932, he says, made this, we don't want to repeat 1932. And then he talks about Hoover sitting idly by and cutting spending at the height of the Great Depression. But when you look at the numbers, you see spending going up through Herbert Hoover's term, but in particular, the deficit as a percentage of GDP rising throughout his term, so that by 1932, by the end of the term, the deficit as the percentage of GDP was at 4.5%. It had been 4% the previous year, so it was actually going up. So Hoover did not slash the economy or slash federal spending at the height of the Depression. To the contrary, he boasted of all the interventionism that he had engaged in. So the history that Krugman wants to tell is just not there. And it's not like these are difficult numbers to uncover. I mean, these are all official matters of record. But here he is, a Nobel Prize winning New York Times economist, and he is at the very least creating the false impression in people's minds that, well, we had that stupid dunderhead from 1929 to 1933 who did all kinds of stupid dunderhead things at a time when we could have used vigorous federal spending, when in fact we got vigorous federal spending. We got plenty of deficit spending in particular, which is generally what Krugman calls for in situations like that. That's what we got, and we're still mired in the Great Depression.
Yeah, I mean, Herbert Hoover was the most interventionist president in U.S. history during peacetime up to that point. And so the analogy I've used a lot is to say, if you want to claim that his inadequate response to the stock market crash is what caused the Great Depression, then that raises the question, it's not like all the previous presidents were more interventionist and then Hoover came along and said, no, I'm not going to do what those previous ones did. So how come the Depression didn't happen, the Great Depression time and time again? It's a bit, the analogy I've used to say, it's like blaming, there's a plane crash and you say, what caused that? It's like, oh, gravity. I mean, yeah, you can say gravity is involved, but obviously there's got to be something more specific than that, because that was true. The unwillingness of presidential administrations to have massive budget deficits during peacetime, that was true throughout U.S. history up to that point. So that really doesn't explain how come the stock market crash of 29 then ended up leading to a decade-long depression.
My dear ladies and gentlemen, time, in the memorable formulation of Ludwig von Mises, is an irreversible flux. The new year is coming up, and we are going to resolve to be more efficient with our time, right? Well, a big part of why I get as much done as I do is my impatience with fluff in all areas of my life. My approach is get to the point. I want my books to tell me just what they need to tell me. And that's what the Blinkist app does for thousands of books in 27 different nonfiction categories. No fluff, just the heart of the matter. You can absorb the Blinkist summary in just 15 minutes of reading or listening. What a time to be alive. Imagine what you can get done on your commute alone. And among the thousands and thousands of titles at Blinkist, you'll also find libertarian classics by Murray Rothbard, Milton Friedman, even a title by your very own host Woods here. Well, right now, Blinkist has a special offer just for our audience. Go to Blinkist.com/Woods to start your 7-day free trial and get 40% off a Blinkist premium membership. That's Blinkist, spelled Blinkist, Blinkist.com/Woods to get 40% off and a 7-day free trial. Blinkist.com/Woods. And now for a limited time, you can even use Blinkist Connect to share your premium account. You'll get 2 premium subscriptions for the price of 1. Let's talk about Krugman's thing where he talked about Social Security and the term and the phrase a Ponzi game aspect was used.
Yes.
And then he had to kind of cover his tracks there. And then more recently, he said it's definitely not a Ponzi scheme. So what was that all about?
Yeah, so this one, just to give people some connection here, this one and the next one we're going to cover, folks, are 2 cases in which Krugman really gets upset when people on the right wing quote him from previous articles. He does not like that. All right, so the one you're referring to here, Tom, is this, for some reason, people must have stumbled upon it in 2011, because now this is a blog post from Krugman, September 14th, 2011. The title he gave it is The Ponzi Thing. And he says, well, I gather that a lot of right-wingers are quoting selectively from a piece I wrote 15 years ago in the Boston Review, in which I said that Social Security had a, quote, Ponzi game aspect. As always, you should read what I actually wrote. Here's the passage. Okay, so Tom, now we're going to be disabused of the idea that there's some Ponzi element involved. And so here Krugman's now giving the context from which, these awful right-wingers were distorting him. So this is Krugman from his earlier piece. Social Security is structured from the point of view of the recipients as if it were an ordinary retirement plan. What you get out depends on what you put in. So it does not look like a redistributionist scheme. In practice, it has turned out to be strongly redistributionist, but only because of its Ponzi game aspect, in which each generation takes more out than it put in. Well, the Ponzi game will soon be over, thanks to changing demographics, so that the typical recipient henceforth will get only about as much as he or she put in, and today's young may well get less than they put in. Okay, so that's what he wrote back then. And so a lot of right-wingers, when they stumbled upon that, were laughing and saying, look at we like calling Social Security a big Ponzi scheme. And look at Krugman called it that too. So now here he is in 2011 trying to explain why that's not what he meant. And so now back to his blog post. Notice what I didn't say. I didn't say that the system was a fraud. I didn't say that it would collapse. I said that in the past it had benefited from the fact that each generation paying into the system was bigger than the generation that preceded it, and that this luxury would be ending in the years ahead. Okay, so I just want to step back and just say, when right wingers who are critics of Social Security call it a Ponzi scheme, what do they mean? Do they mean it doesn't have the force of law behind it? No, that's not what they mean. They mean exactly what Krugman just pointed out, and that the benefits will have to be slashed and the taxes on existing workers will have to be raised to make this thing work, and that what people right now think they're getting, they will not get. And so, yes, if Ponzi himself had been allowed to do that, his scheme also wouldn't have collapsed. The reason a private sector Ponzi scheme collapses is because when people violate the rules and it's determined that, oh, wait a minute, the rules aren't going to be what you said originally, then it kind of falls apart. And also the critical thing, so I do agree in this respect, it's not a Ponzi scheme because at least with the private sector Ponzi scheme, people can't be compelled to contribute to it. They have to be tricked into doing it. Whereas with Social Security, you can know full well, yeah, I'm going to be putting money in this and I could do so much better with an alternative investment strategy, but you have to put money in or you go to jail. So yeah, I guess he is right in that sense. Social Security is not like a Ponzi scheme.
So that's one where he doesn't like, but there's another one that he doesn't like people quoting. That's not one that we have in our list, but and this may be, I don't know, maybe you can let him off the hook because nobody has a crystal ball, but there is that quotation about the internet's impact on the economy. We may look back and find that it's no greater than that of the fax machine. I mean, I don't know, like nobody's maybe we could be generous with that one, Bob.
Yeah. So that, I mean, that is true. And that is often like when his retirement was announced, that is the one that people were tweeting that around and going like, oh, how come he didn't tell us with the fax machine? Ha ha, or something like that.
Right.
And I understand. I'm by no means criticizing anyone for using that as a way to make fun of them, more power to you. But yeah, I never really got into that because it was more of just a one-off. And I know you like this phrase, Tom. In fairness, what Krugman was doing there, he was asked, like it was some column where they were being asked to make long-term projections, or so. I don't remember the exact content, but it was something like, what's the world going to be like in the year 2030, or what's going to be surprising in the year 2030, looking back to what people, you know what I mean? So they were kind of being goaded into say something provocative,
right?
You know what I mean? So I can, like, yeah, I think that's funny, but in terms of stuff he said, that yeah, I don't think that's like the top five.
Right, because I wouldn't want to be on the hook for every provocative prediction I made. I'm sure some of them were ridiculous, but that's actually why I generally avoid making predictions. And I always use this lame excuse that as a historian, I deal only with the past, because then I know for sure that I'm right.
Is that why all the historians agree with each other?
I beg your pardon?
Is that why all the historians agree with each other?
Don't even get me started about my stupid profession. All right. Although, we're only 10% worse than your stupid profession. All right. So how about this one? This one he really did say. And he's got to really dance around this one. But this thing where he says that it was necessary for Greenspan to take the tech bubble, so this .com bubble from the late 90s into 2000. And as that was deflating, replace it with a housing bubble. Now, Ron Paul acknowledged that. Ron Paul said in 2001 on the House floor that was what Greenspan and the Fed were doing, that we had this deflating tech bubble, and what they're doing instead now is, in order to prevent any economy-wide reckoning from that, they're just going to blow up another bubble and just try to keep things going that way. And so then you wound up with a case where we had, for the first time on record anyway, we had housing starts actually going up during a downturn, which was, as I said, never seen that happen before. And Ron Paul was predicting that this would lead to very bad problems. And in fact, it did. It led to we saw what happened with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and a lot of people who were in real estate or who had been speculatively in real estate or had come to the conclusion that they had experienced a tremendous windfall because of the growth in their home values, and they had taken out home equity loans, and then suddenly everything turns around on them. It was a really bad disaster, not to mention major financial institutions just were no more after the reckoning from that thing. So, how would we steelman Krugman saying that the Fed needed to do something like that? I mean, what do we...
Well, I can tell you what he said about it. And so again, this is a thing where Krugman just gets very upset when these people on the right had the audacity to quote him. So this is a blog post he put out on June 17th, 2009. And the title he gave it was, "And I was on the grassy knoll too." All right. So for foreign listeners, he's making an allusion there to the Kennedy assassination, where a popular alternative view to the official account is that there were shooters on the grassy knoll. And so Krugman here is saying like, oh yeah, I had something to do with the housing bubble and I killed Kennedy too. Haha, that's what a bad guy I am. So here's what he says. One of the funny aspects of being a somewhat, and that's his in there in the blog post, forceful writer is that I'm regularly accused of all sorts of villainy. I was personally responsible for the demise of Enron, blah, blah, blah. Okay, a couple things I'm skipping. The latest seems to be that I called for the creation of a housing bubble. In fact, the bubble is my fault. The claim seems to be based on this piece. Okay, so even there, he says the claim seems to be based on this piece, as if it's not clear where the critics are coming from, right? You know what I mean?
But the best he can come up with is maybe it's this one.
Right, and so then he says, guys, read it again. It wasn't a piece of policy advocacy. It was just economic analysis. What I said was that the only way the Fed could get traction would be if it could inflate a housing bubble. And that's just what happened. All right. So let's just quickly, this will be fairly quick here. I'll give the 2-paragraph context of this and to see if, so Tom, to answer your question, what Krugman is saying, I mean, he's not even sure what piece they have in mind, but I'll read this one and then you can see that, probably this is the one they had in mind. And so his point is to say, no, I wasn't saying that Greenspan should do this. I was just saying this is the only option he has left. Okay, so here we go. So this is Krugman talking in 2002. A few months ago, the vast majority of business economists mocked concerns about a double dip, a second leg to the downturn. But there were a few dogged iconoclasts out there, most notably Stephen Roach and Morgan Stanley. As I've repeatedly said in this column, the arguments of the double dippers, meaning a double dip recession, folks, made a lot of sense, and their story now looks more plausible than ever, right? So he's saying the people warning the economy is going to slip back into recession, it looks like they were onto something. So this is still Krugman now. The basic point is that the recession of 2001 wasn't a typical post-war slump brought on when an inflation-fighting Fed raises interest rates and easily ended by a snapback in housing and consumer spending when the Fed brings rates back down again. This was a pre-war style recession, a morning after, brought on by irrational exuberance. To fight this recession, the Fed needs more than a snapback. It needs soaring household spending to offset moribund business investment. And to do that, as Paul McCulley of PIMCO put it, Alan Greenspan needs to create a housing bubble to replace the NASDAQ bubble. Okay, so again, without just going through and reading more, but I'm telling you folks, if you go and read that, yes, it's pessimistic, but he's saying, because I don't think Greenspan's going to be able to pull this off, that's what's going to need to happen. And so that's, as you can see, folks, when Krugman says, I think they must be talking about this one. Yeah, that's when they're talking about, Krugman, where you said, quoting someone else, Greenspan needs to replace it with a housing bubble. And what's funny is I was actually steel manning him in my recollection, Tom. A lot of times when I'm like in public and referring to this, I would say, I think maybe he called it a boom. And you know what I mean? Because a boom just sounds like, a strong, vigorous, growing economy, whereas bubble almost by definition means it's unsupported by the fundamentals.
Right.
And so even in my recollection, I was giving him more of the benefit of the doubt, say, no, actually, I don't know. Did he actually call for a bubble? Maybe he said housing boom. Like I would catch myself to make sure I wasn't, distorted. But no, he said bubble. And then we don't, we need to document it all here. But over the years, after his initial, and I was on the grassy knoll too, he just kept coming because people just kept hammering because they went up and dug up more things. It wasn't just that one-off thing. Like people dug up video and such of him over the years early on, talking about, the rising, spending on housing and how that's the asset he's spending is replacing it and da-da-da, right? So there was lots of other stuff showing that Krugman was fine with what was going on at that point and that thought this was what Greenspan needed to do. And so he just kept coming back and he had various lines of defense. And so, there he said, oh, it was just, I wasn't endorsing it. At another point, he said, I was just quoting somebody else. I wasn't approving of that. And then one time he said, I was just joking. He said, come on, guys, you don't recognize a joke. And, and the person, spelling that out was just like saying, how could any English speaker read that column and think he was making a joke? That's not what, was happening there. So in any event, that was just a classic Krugman episode where people had the audacity to quote him from before. And also, too, this isn't some weird thing. Like, that's the Austrian critique of Keynesianism. As you say, Tom, that was Ron Paul's point here. That's how Keynesianism works, is they just keep spawning one asset bubble after another. And you're never going to get out of that cycle.
All right, folks, the days may be shorter now, but especially during the Christmas season, something tells me that your to-do list is only getting longer. So a great way to power through your busy days is with Factor's no prep, no mess meals. From breakfast to dinner and anything in between, Factor has easy, nutritious options to keep you fueled and feeling your best. It's cheaper than takeout and dining out. You can customize your offerings to pursue your particular goals. So managing calories, maximizing protein intake, even avoiding meat if you want. It's up to you. And the food tastes great. You'll find guilt-free comfort foods like home-style chicken and gravy, loaded mashed potato pork chops, and you'll find gourmet plus dishes that feature premium proteins like truffle butter filet mignon and seasonal sides like broccolini, leeks, and asparagus. Factor's meals are fresh, never frozen, and they're ready in no time. No prep, no cleanup. So use your time more efficiently, so important during these dark months. Let Factor take shopping, prepping, cooking, and cleaning up off your daily list of things to do. Head to factormeals.com/woods50 and use code WOODS50 to get 50% off your first box and 20% off your next month. That's code WOODS50 at factormeals.com/woods50 to get 50% off your first box plus 20% off your next month while your subscription is active. All right, let's see what we got here on the greatest hits. You know, I should have brought some Cheez-Its and some tangerine juice, both of which I have. I'm sorry to say, now in this age of RFK Jr., we do have some Cheez-Its in the Woods household, even now.
Is tangerine juice too sugary? Would he be opposed to that?
Oh, that he might be okay with in moderation. But it was more the Cheez-Its I was reproaching myself for. But I went off tangerine juice for several years after Contra Krugman. And people would come up to me and joke about it, and I would say, "Look, I'm past that, man. You're living in the past, man." And then, like a week ago, my wife bought me some out of the blue, and doggone it, Bob, I forgot how good it is. I was right the first time.
Yeah.
It's a good drink, delicious. So
you know where you won't see someone running away from his past statements. Right.
Well, as a matter of fact, half of this episode is about somebody running away from his past statements, unfortunately. In fact, he's running away from his whole column at this point. All right. Well, we did, I'm trying to remember if we actually did an episode on it or if it was just an article you wrote. But regardless of whether it was one or the other, there was a couple of economists had come out with, there was a series of examples showing that quote unquote austerity had been followed in certain cases by economic prosperity. Because remember, after 2008, there were allegedly all these cases of quote unquote austerity, which was supposed to imply very, very heavy government budget cuts around the world. And there was a lot of very critical commentary about that. But we had some examples show, here's a case. So it was either your column or our episode. There were like 9 examples floating around, total about 9 of them. And finally, Krugman said, all right, well, I'm going to write a column about this and show that none of these apply and that actually what really leads to good economic outcomes is, of course, what? Deficit spending. So he goes through the 9, and each one he's got some way of weaseling out of it. All right, well, maybe 1 or 2 of them you could weasel out of. Maybe even 4 or 5. But I mean, all 9 examples, there's all some escape hatch for him. Like he can't say, all right, this one's a toughie, I admit. But no, there's always some escape hatch. So then we think, all right, well, then what are his positive examples of so-called fiscal stimulus leading to a strong economy? Because we were just looking at alleged examples of austerity measures leading to a strong economy. He says none of them hold. So what about Krugman's favored policy response? Let's look at examples there. And what's interesting is we're not given any examples. The alleged examples we are given are actually all counterfactuals. For example, the 1930s, we're given that. The 1930s was double-digit unemployment the whole decade. And that's what they're giving us there counterexample, but they're saying that it would have been worse if it hadn't been for us. Now, of course, there's absolutely no way to go back and prove that. That's just an assertion. It would have been worse. So they were able to come up with, or the Obama stimulus. Well, the Obama stimulus was not followed by immediate prosperity. And so, well, then how do they use that as an example? Well, again, it would have been worse if we hadn't done it. So in other words, the austerity people have real live empirical examples from history, recent history. And the Krugman side, what do they have? They have no actual empirical examples, except what they have is a couple of episodes from history in which you had a bad economy that stayed bad, but their claim is if it hadn't been for us, it would have been even worse. There's something very deeply, deeply unpersuasive about that, I think, to the average person.
Yes, and just to give people a little more, so I can't remember, it was some unexpected organization that put out this original study, and what they called it, folks, was like historical episodes of expansionary austerity, and it was something, it was like the World Bank or somebody like that. It might not have been them, but it was something where, you might have thought like, oh yeah, they're going to be a bunch of gobbledygook, centrists at best. But anyway, so I was pleasantly surprised that happened. And their main finding was they said it's often a commonplace to associate fiscal austerity with a weak economy, like in belt tightening and people rising unemployment, whatever. And they said, but actually that's because historically a lot of times when a government has a big budget deficit, they will do a combination of spending cuts and tax hikes. And they said, however, if we just look at cases where the governments primarily relied on spending cuts and didn't also raise taxes, then there's plenty of examples, like you say, Tom, where the economy didn't dip into recession and it just kind of kept growing. So that's all consistent with, not just Austria, but kind of like general free market thinking that, yeah, if you got an economy that's on the ropes, you don't want to jack up taxes. That's not going to help anybody. That doesn't prove reducing the deficit is a bad idea. That proves that tax hikes are a bad idea, right? So they had a bunch of examples. And so just to give folks an idea of what Tom means when he says Krugman went through and for every example, just like, talked it away. One was Canada in the mid 1990s. It had a serious debt problem. And such like the Wall Street Journal or somebody said, Canada's in danger of, having their debt downgraded and they might be lumped in with, sort of mid-tier countries, not like where you would think they should be. And so the government got real serious and they did hike taxes a little bit, but it was mostly spending cuts. And I don't mean slowing the rate of growth. I mean, they actually reduced spending in absolute terms, like two or 3 years in a row. And they went from running a string of budget deficits to they had a string of budget surpluses and pretty strongly reduced debt to GDP. And they didn't have a recession for many years after they did this experiment, right? So it was a pretty clear-cut case of if you thought cutting spending when the economy wasn't in great shape would lead to a recession, that was a good counterexample. And so Krugman explained that away, and he said, oh, well, what happened was they just boosted their exports. And so, and that's not a general solution because the whole world can't just net export to each other. So that was the kind of thing he did, folks, is like, so in isolation, just in terms of standard free market economics, if the government cuts spending, then interest rates drop. That makes your currency actually weaken against other currencies because foreigners aren't as interested in buying your debt. And then that makes it easier to export, right? So that's a very straightforward thing that would happen if one country happens to cut its government spending, is that you would see its exports go up. And so Krugman was like pointing to that obvious consequence and saying, oh, well, that proves that we can't use that in general because not every country can net export at the same time. So therefore, nope, out of bounds. And anyway, I'm just saying, like, he did that for all whatever it was, 8 or 9 examples, would come up with some reason that no, that's not, Immanuel Kant would not say that that's something we can now generalize. So sorry, that doesn't count. And like you say, again, just to emphasize, folks, Krugman literally did not have one example where his proposal worked in the sense of the economy was in bad shape. They did what Krugman thought should be done, and the economy got better. No, always, 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 the economy got even worse in absolute terms. And again, they just said, wow, look how bad the economy was. It's a good thing we had those deficits. Unfortunately, they were too small. But it's a good thing we didn't do nothing like the Austerians suggested. Otherwise, everyone would have died. So, if doctors were arguing about a medical treatment, and anyway, you can fill in the blanks of how that would work. That when we're arguing about whether this is a cure or a tonic or a poison, and you have that track record, it's just kind of funny how Krugman, among other things, likes to pat himself on the back for being empirical and not ideological like those free market idiots.
And yet, I hate to make this kind of argument, but seriously, you can imagine if Krugman were up against people making that kind of argument, he would point that out. He would say, where are your examples? All your examples are from imaginary fairylands that have never occurred. They're all economies that are better than they would have been, that they're worse, but they're better than they would have been if they hadn't had your treatment. I don't know, maybe they're worse because of your treatment. I mean, you could easily see him there's no way he would let you,
right.
Tom and Bob get away with that.
Yep. And if I may, just to drive home, folks, on the...
it's egalitarian here on Contra Krugman.
Yes, thank you. On the Obama stimulus package, that one was particularly egregious because, Obama's the newly elected president. He's coming in. It's Christina Romer and Jared Bernstein were the chair and vice chair, or whatever the number 2 position was called, of the Council of Economic Advisors. And they did the economic analysis, making the case for what we now refer to as the Obama stimulus package. And I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but unemployment was, I think, 7% and change when this analysis came out. And it warned, saying if we do nothing, unemployment's going to get up to 8%. But if we pass this, we'll contain the rise to such and such. So they did get the stimulus package, and unemployment not only went higher than what they said would happen if we had the stimulus package, it went higher than what they warned would happen if we do nothing. So in terms of what could the data possibly show to make people think, maybe the stimulus made things worse, it couldn't have been better than that. And again, they just said, wow, the economy was in worse shape than we realized. It's good that we passed that. It's just too bad it was too little, too late. But man, we really needed that stimulus because look how bad the economy was in, the shape the economy was. So again, it was a tautology that they just think the way the world works is government deficit spending creates more employment than otherwise would be the case. And so, and in fairness, they're not wrong just from that one thing. Like, it's possible somebody goes in to get chemotherapy and he dies from cancer. That one case doesn't prove chemotherapy doesn't work. But if every single person who went in, the doctor said, you got this much time to live, but if you get chemotherapy, we can extend it, and everyone died sooner than what the doctor warned would happen without chemotherapy, after a while, you might start wondering, I'm not sure this is helping.
You could imagine somebody saying, and in fact, I think probably you and I have said, what exactly would have to happen in the real world for a Keynesian to say, maybe my counter-cyclical policy doesn't work? Like, what exactly would have to happen if not what we see all around us? I mean, what would you have to see? But on the other hand, I could see Krugman's side saying, well, you dogmatic Austrians, you're not going to change your opinions on the basis of empirical examples, so why should we? So what would your response to that be?
So for one thing, so number one is we often couch our analysis both in terms of like our policy conclusions, both in terms of like ethical issues and, economic predictions, or not predictions, but like positive statements about how the economy works. All right. So it's, I think as libertarians, it's fine to say like, yes, even if for some reason it would cause more employment, still, robbing people at gunpoint or whatever, I think it is immoral. Right. So it's not that your libertarian views would necessarily be in jeopardy. And I think certainly people like Murray Rothbard were clear about that. And some say, oh, that's why he's showing he's so partisan. But no, I think that shows that, the corpus of libertarianism doesn't depend just on, that specific thing. Beyond that, though, I disagree. I mean, I certainly have been much more careful about saying things about price inflation, for example. I infamously lost a bet in 2010-ish on that matter. And so, yeah, it's not that made me flip all of a sudden and now I'm pro QE or something, but I am much more careful about how I talk about those things. I've changed my views on a lot of things, regarding like international trade, for example. My views on that have definitely evolved over time. Not so much because of empirical evidence, but just because of people bringing up objections and I'm just realizing, just to give you an example, Tom, to beat up on the mercantilists to say, oh yeah, they just thought importing gold coins and silver coins would make their nation wealthier. Now I'm like, well, it actually did, right? Like your households, other things equal, the more gold you have in the treasury, that's not a bad thing, right? So anyway, I'm just saying my views have evolved over time, even though we rely on the a priori method in economics. If I realized there was a mistake in my reasoning or there was some consideration I left out, I am happy to alter that. So I guess that's what I would respond with.
All right, fair enough answer. Well, what about here we have, it's not clear whether we have empirical examples of alien invasions. We may have had alien visitations. We're not taking a position on that here on Contra Krugman. We're agnostic. Are you agnostic on that question?
I am agnostic on that question, yes.
Okay. So
I do not
we have to reckon
Tucker
with
Carlson's
Paul
a liar.
Krugman, who at least wanted us to imagine it as a thought experiment, as in illustration of the value of, again, Keynesian policy during a difficult economic time. So what exactly, do we even have a clip related to this?
Yeah, we'll play the clip, folks. Let me just set the clip up. So it's here, Krugman is on a CNN show. Ken Rogoff is a much more, he's Keynesian, but he's much more reasonable. And I think, I can't remember if he was at Harvard or MIT. But anyway, they're both, in the Boston area. And so just in case people don't know the reference. So Rogoff, he is in favor of deficit spending, but he wants to be reasonable about it and say, as long as infrastructure makes sense. And he says, not like these big prices. And so there he's referring to infamous infrastructure spending in the Boston area that was way over price, way over budget, and just took forever to come through. And then there was
probably the big dig.
Yes, right. That's what he's referring to. So that's just for people who don't know the rest. So that's the context here. So that Rogoff is going to go first, and then the host, steeped in Keynesian economics, is going to say, well, no, what does it matter? And so anyway, we'll go ahead and play the clip, and you'll see.
Infrastructure spending, if it were well spent, that's great. I'm all for that. I'd borrow for that, assuming we're not paying Boston big dig kind of prices for the infrastructure.
But even if you were, wouldn't John Maynard Keynes say that if you could employ people to dig a ditch and then fill it up again, that's fine. They're being productively employed. They pay taxes. So maybe Boston's big dig was just fine after all.
Think about World War II, right? That was actually negative social product spending, and yet it brought us out. I mean, partly because you want to put these things together. If we say, look, we could use some inflation, Ken and I are both saying that, which is, of course, anathema to a lot of people in Washington, but is in fact what the basic logic says. It's very hard to get inflation in a depressed economy. But if you had a program of government spending plus an expansionary policy by the Fed, you could get that. So if you think about using all of these things together, you could accomplish, a great deal. I mean, if we discovered that space aliens were planning to attack, and we needed a massive buildup to counter the space alien threat, and really inflation and budget deficits took secondary place to that, this slump would be over in 18 months. And then if we discovered, whoops, we made a mistake, there aren't actually any space aliens.
So we need Orson Welles, is what you're saying.
No, there was a Twilight Zone episode like this in which scientists fake the alien threat in order to achieve world peace. Well, this time we don't need it. We need it in order to get some fiscal stimulus.
All right, so that's become somewhat infamous. But the idea here, the key thing here is not the alien invasion aspect, but the purpose of the alien invasion example is to show that even if there were no alien invasion, we just thought there was an alien invasion, it would still be beneficial for us to engage in the spending, because it doesn't matter what the spending is on. That's what some of the, is that what, do all Keynesians think that way? That it actually does not matter, strictly speaking, what the spending is on?
I mean, I guess if they didn't think that, I guess they wouldn't be a good Keynesian. So I think yes, and so as far as it goes. So in fairness, again, so Rogoff there, I think his point is, let's be sure to try to get something good for the money. And then again, the host pushing him was just saying, but strictly speaking, that's not essentially the argument, right? So I don't know if Rogoff would have, well, no, I mean, even at the end of the clip there, time you kind of saw Rogoff was still being a bit sarcastic about, oh, we need Orson Welles. So I guess to answer your question, Tom, if we were going to classify Rogoff as a Keynesian, that he was not in favor of what Krugman was saying and thought it was kind of absurd. But yes, the essential point, and this isn't something Krugman made up. Number one, sometimes people say Krugman was pining for an alien invasion. No, he was pining for the public to believe in an alien invasion,
right,
so they would be okay with the government running huge deficits. That was the point of his analogy or his example there, his thought experiment. And so, yeah, we build a bunch of weapons that we don't end up needing, and we can just even like throw them in the ocean. That's fine. Okay, so so he was agreeing with the host's point that yes, if we're going to build something useful, that's gravy, but we don't need to. And Keynes famously, I don't remember if it was actually in the general theory or later. I think it was in the general theory.
Famously, literally dig up holes and fill them back in?
What Keynes said was if the government took money and put it into bottles and buried it in a garbage heap and then had private enterprise come and like if you found the bottle, you got to keep the money inside. So that was Keynes's example. I think it was in the general theory. That was definitely something he said in print. He may have also said dig holes and fill them up. I don't know, but for sure
but
he
I
said
remember the bottles example.
Yeah. So yeah, and that again, it's not, folks, to be clear, it's not that John Maynard Keynes was saying this is what I think government should do, but he was just saying to make the point so you get it, that would be better than doing nothing. And so all the more, how good would it be if we paid people to build bridges and, clean up litter and stuff like that? Because just even going and finding money that we bury in garbage dumps would actually promote employment and spending and blah, blah, blah. So to me, it's good. And that's kind of what I was getting at earlier, Tom, at the start of this, when I was saying Krugman's existence was useful because he would come up with stuff like that. It was very clear what his position was because he's a creative guy. He's clever. And, he would say things like that just to really make sure there was no misunderstanding. Whereas with Rogoff, you might kind of say, oh, well, yeah, well, if the public could use a bridge, then maybe now when interest rates are low, it's a good time. We got all these unemployed construction workers. Now's a good time to build a bridge rather than down the, that's kind of confusing because it's conflating different things. Whereas Krugman was crystal clear. No, even just building stuff that's completely useless is better than doing nothing. Don't listen to these Republicans.
So I think what sometimes happened with Krugman is that bell curve meme that we've seen. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So on one side, you have people who are not really formally educated and maybe even not all that bright. Then on the other side, you have like the geniuses. And then you have the midwits in the middle, like the 105, 110 IQ people. So on the one side, people will say, Krugman says, be good to prepare for alien invasion that never comes. That's the dumbest thing I ever heard. And then the midwit says, but wait a minute, what it actually means is the economic activity that would be prompted by the... And then the genius people say, Krugman thinks it would be good to,
right.
They agree with the original folks.
Yeah, not that we need to get sidetracked, but a beautiful illustration of that phenomenon, Tom, is with the government debt being a burden to future generations, that whole thing.
Yeah.
Where, yes, like this standard right-wing Fox News kind of guy, like, oh no, the government shouldn't be running a deficit because that's like us just giving, passing the tab down to our grandkids. And that's a little bit simplistic and yeah, it's not clear. And then Krugman comes along and says, well, no, because if we also pass the treasury bonds down, then it's a wash as far as future generations are concerned. It's just, some of our grandkids are paying interest to other of our grandkids and so on. And then, like you say, then the actual smart, Buchanan and people like that come along. And then me, after I, realized what was going on and explaining it to people, was that no, actually there is a subtle sense because today's generation doesn't just necessarily hand over the treasury bonds. They might sell them to existing workers. And so in that sense, it really is like an intergenerational transfer. And there is a legitimate sense in which you are living at the expense of unborn generations who aren't even alive to vote on the matter. And, so that it's the boomer who's thinking, no, we should just pay our bills fair and square and not have huge deficits. There is something very defensible in that, even though, that person couldn't write out an economic model and explain exactly how, and he wouldn't be able to answer Krugman's objections.
All right, let's take a look at where we are on this. Oh, so do we also have the clip for Krugman talking about healthcare in Canada in
Yes,
front of an
and-
audience.
yes,
he
and it's very
apparently
apropos-
didn't know as well as he thought.
Yeah, it's very apropos, given the current discussion about, oh, geez, don't these Americans know that everyone else has got great health care and it's not for profit? So, yeah, this is one of my favorite Krugman episodes where this just blows up in his face. And folks, as we're getting ready to play this clip, just watch here. It's not just that Krugman was wrong. Look at how gleeful he is in the beginning and how sure he is that he's right and these idiot right-wingers don't know what they're talking about and how it doesn't turn out well for him.
Yeah, actually, can I just do? I wanted to ask a question. And
Please
good
go
time.
ahead.
I wanted to ask actually 2 questions to the audience. First, how many Canadians? Would Canadians in the room please raise your hands?
We have about 7 hands.
Not as many as I thought. Okay, of those of you who are not on the panel who are Canadians, how many of you think you have a terrible healthcare system?
We
1,
see
2, couple.
almost all of the same hands going up.
Bad move on my part.
Well, that was kind of embarrassing.
Yeah.
So, I would want to make absolutely sure I knew that crowd inside and out before I throw a matzo ball like that out there. I mean,
Or at the very least, not say, here, let me try something. Yeah, just to say, I'm curious to see how this goes, but just on the off chance, sort of like Hillary Clinton clearly did not have a concession speech ready. It didn't even occur to her that she might lose. So,
right. But it just never dawned on him that anybody would have seen this differently from how he sees it. But
right. That I think you're right to point out here that this isn't just like, aha, that was embarrassing. It's not like he went up to try it, amateur hour at the Improv and his jokes bombed or something. It's that, yes, he is just and this is why we've talked about, Tom, over the years, how I can be in Europe and people will come up to me and just thank me for the Krugman podcast. And why is that? And why was there a cruise devoted to him? It's because he was so smug and dismissive and just so nasty with the people he disagreed with that whenever he was caught really doing something stupid, everyone just loved it. And that's why people liked our podcast so much. In other words, it wasn't just that they disagree with. There are plenty of Keynesians that are, a Contra Krugman podcast would not have been as popular just because, he's not a complete jerk.
Well, I think I have this sense that they wouldn't cheer us on, but that I think some of his colleagues probably weren't all that unhappy that there was a Contra Krugman podcast. I mean, I recall him being somewhat nasty to Jeffrey Sachs, who doesn't really see eye to eye with us, but he doesn't deserve to be ridiculed and treated like an idiot by Krugman.
Yeah, I don't think I'm speaking out of school. It might have even been public. But yeah, when there was a period, unfortunately, Tom, I can't remember the exact details, but Krugman was disagreeing publicly with Sachs and he was misrepresenting what Sachs said. And then I jumped in to clarify. And it wasn't even like it was something I cared about one way or the other, as far as I can recall. It was just, I couldn't stand idly by because I realized how much Krugman was mischaracterizing Sachs' position. And so I jumped in, and then Sachs, I don't know if it was public or if he sent me a private note, but he just said something like, hey, thanks, I appreciated that. So yeah, for what that's worth.
Oh, well, actually that is nice.
Yeah.
And Sachs is good on he's had some interesting good things to say on foreign policy, especially late.
Am I right in thinking that not just good, but like courageous in the sense that, he's got a bunch of, he doesn't need to stick his neck out like that. Like he's got bridges he might be burning because, he's Jeffrey Sachs and yet he just feels like, no, I need to say these things.
He's not making himself more welcome among his peers and colleagues. That's for sure. Now, these examples that Bob and I have been giving, these were the things we came up with as we thought about what were the greatest examples of Krugman's slipperiness or a downright wrongness over the years. But this is all mere prologue to what is to come, ladies and gentlemen, because we've been working up to something.
Yeah.
And the one we're working up to, this really absolutely has to take the cake. It absolutely has to take the cake. And it has to do with deficit spending suddenly becoming a concern at a very, very interestingly timed moment. Bob, I've teed it up for you.
Yes.
To just smash it out of the park here.
And this, you know what, Tom? I had forgotten until your description there of the term I invented, which was a Krugman contradiction with a K. And if you remember what that meant was, it wasn't so much that what he was saying was a contradiction with a C, but it was that he knew what he wanted the answer to be. And the answer was, when a Democrat is the president, deficit spending works. And when a Republican is the president, deficit spending is bad. And so it's not that he would say deficit spending is always good and then flip to say deficit spending is always bad. It's just, you could tell the reasons he picked were always hand-tailored to fit whatever it needed to be, so that would be the conclusion that would pop out of his objective economic analysis. And so, as Tom says, the epitome of this phenomenon had to do with the 2016 campaign. So in August of 2016, Krugman had a column titled "Time to Borrow." And he wrote, "The campaign still has 3 ugly months to go, but the odds are they will end with the election of a sane, sensible president." He's referring to Hillary Clinton. "So what should she do to boost America's economy, which is doing better than most of the world, but is still falling far short of where it should be? There are, of course, many ways our economic policy could be improved, but the most important thing we need is sharply increased public investment in everything from energy to transportation to wastewater treatment. And how should we pay for this investment? We shouldn't. Not now or anytime soon. Right now, there is an overwhelming case for more government borrowing." So again, that was August 2016 when Krugman looked at the odds, and it was 83% chance that Hillary Clinton was going to win. Hillary Clinton did not win that election. Now, in January 2017, so I leave it as an exercise to the listener, that's less than 1 year later, okay? August 2016,
it's not even half
January
a year
27. The title, so Krugman doesn't pick the titles, but the titles were fair. Again, the previous one, August 2016, was "Time to Borrow." The title that the Times gave to Krugman's January 2017 op-ed was "Deficits Matter Again." And there he was saying how he was concerned about the reckless spending that might happen under the incoming Trump administration. Not so much the reckless spending, but with the tax cuts that, he was going to bring in. And, we really got to watch out for deficits now. And so this harkens back to Krugman under the George W. Bush years said he was going to go refinance his home mortgage because he was so terrified about what I think at the time was like a $300 billion-ish deficit was going to do to interest rates. And then, of course, Krugman made, a mini career out of saying why the deficits in the Obama years were totally fine. And so people accused him of flip-flopping, and he would, how could you possibly suggest, no, you don't understand, the economy was different. And so then here we had another example where the time span was condensed, and it went from August 2016 to January 2017, where it was first time to borrow, and then, oh no, deficits matter again. And incidentally, just for completion, and we did do an episode on this, Tom, if you go through the reasons Krugman gives for why, for what he said about Trump, it did mattering, like a lot of that was true under Clinton. And then I think more specifically, if you went and looked at the August 2016 column for why Krugman said it's time to borrow, those things were all still true in January 2017, right? So anyway, that was the example of what I'm saying. So that's about the Krugman contradiction. It's that the criteria he selected to explain why this is the answer of my completely positive, non-ideological, nonpartisan analysis, he just changed what the criteria were to determine is it time to borrow or not.
So, and of course, knowing that Trump would be in a position where, very little, there's no way the structure of the federal budget and the level of federal borrowing is going to change very much with the change of administration. But what does change is that now he's able to use that as a source of criticism rather than praise.
Yeah, exactly. Just like, again, in the George W. Bush years, that was a big... And actually, to go back to your depression example, I remember that was one of the points I made, was that the budget deficit under Hoover was as big as a share of economy as it was in the Reagan years. And, I don't remember all the Democrats at the time complaining about what a weak-willed deficit runner Ronald Reagan was. I kind of remember them saying how his awful tax cuts for the rich just sank our country into debt, and this is a complete profligacy and completely irresponsible. as FDR did in the 32 election, complaining that Herbert Hoover was a big spender. And we, while the private sector is having to tighten their belts, here's Herbert Hoover spending money like a drunken sailor. That was also a key part of FDR's first presidential run, for what that's worth.
Bob, I hate to have to say it, but I think we might be at the end. Is that possible? Are we at the end of another episode?
I think so. And it's almost like, how Mises University, like that last day would almost be depressing. As this approached, I almost don't want to end the point, but I think what more can we say on this last one? And yeah, I do feel like we may have to wrap it up.
So we officially now, although it seemed pretty official because episode 225 of Contra Krugman was called the final episode. Like that seemed like, but on the other hand, maybe this is like another Who farewell tour, something like that. There are a lot of bands that have had farewell tours well beyond the initial farewell. This was our farewell tour. But I would say that unless Krugman's going to come out of retirement, probably we're not going to. Probably this is it on Contra Krugman. But we appreciate your support over the years on that. We're going to keep on doing BobMurphyShow.com is where the Bob Murphy Show can be found. Of course, TomWoods.com for me. And Bob, I guess you and I will just pledge to each other, to the audience, that when circumstances call for it, and there are particularly bad fallacies out there, we will band together again and give them a good old smash like the old days.
I couldn't find a better person to do it with, Tom. Thank you for having me on.
Very kind of you to say. By the way, as I was looking through this, I don't know if this is something, did you actually say this on the episode, or did some clever person in like a YouTube comment or something say it? But there's some, I don't know, is it International Panel on Climate Change? Is that what IPCC stands for?
Intergovernmental Panel.
Intergovernmental Panel on,
yeah.
Okay. And they've been talking about 1.5 degrees Celsius as their goal for, trying to reduce global temperatures, right?
The ceiling on warming, yes.
Okay, so 1.5. Did you actually say, because we talked about that at one point, and so therefore we had to use the number 1.5. And did you say something like, now by 1.5, we're not referring to the number of economists on this show. We're talking about, was that your line? Did you say that?
Oh boy.
Because somebody might have attributed it to you, or somebody else might have said it. But if you didn't say that, I wish you had, because that's a great line. Because the joke, everybody, in case you don't know it, is that I don't have a degree in economics. So I don't even know if I deserve to be a half, but that still is a funny line. Yeah. It's a shame if you didn't say it, but let's just go with you said that, and it's part of the lore of the show.
Yeah, I would love to say that I did, but probably since it's not jumping out, I mean, it is familiar. Like once you said it, I remember that was a thing. So but probably I would be more like, oh yeah, I totally said that. So on the other hand, though, I don't know if you've had this. I've had, Tom, people email me columns that I wrote for Mises.org in like 2007, and I have no recollection of writing it whatsoever. But by forensic analysis, I can conclude I am the only person on earth who could have written it. So I know that I wrote it, but I have no recollection of writing it. And I'm talking like a long critique of like a Steve Landsberger. I mean, it's not just a little blog post. So maybe I did. I'm going to remain agnostic. Maybe I did have that joke. I just can't remember.
Well, perhaps we'll discover someday. But either way, Bob Murphy, I hope people will check out the Bob Murphy Show. Thank you for revisiting our old days of glory. And I don't know. I don't know if I want to thank Paul Krugman, but certainly you gave us ample material to work with and to teach people economics by teaching the opposite of. So I guess there's some merit in that. So thank you, Bob, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Make yourself and those you love less vulnerable to the regime, both mentally and physically. Get more forbidden information at tomsfreebooks.com and be sure to subscribe to the show wherever you listen. See you next time.
Like the sound of The Tom Woods Show? My audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.